That's what it seemed like. Seemed like when people were calling into the stream to ask questions, that the audio was really, really quiet. So I'm going to keep a closer eye on that this time. Make sure that everything is actually audible. Audible is the word I was looking for. Can you join? Yeah. Shoot a multi-guest request, or better yet, my Discord is in the link tree, which is in my profile. Join via Discord. You can hop into the voice chat there. I'm actually going to hop into the voice channel in Discord now. So if anyone wants to join in there, that's going to be the easiest way, because then I don't have to manually add people. I only have to manually kick people when they get annoying. Much better. How effective are non-stimulant medications for ADHD? So on certain symptom measures, equally as effective, no difference. But it seems like in terms of tolerability, like in terms of like side effects and things like that, they seem to be a bit less tolerable for quite a few people than stimulants. Like people report feeling like a zombie or whatever. So non-stimulants can have like a bit less desirability to take them because of those side effects. And it seems like for long-term use only, atomoxetine as a non-stimulant produced like equally good long-term outcomes. The others still produced outcomes, but not as good as stimulant classes. But for like short to mid-term, it seems like they're equally as effective. York saw my stream the other night. Thanks for my work. Performance stress tips. Appreciate it. Thanks for tuning in another night. Nice to see you here. Performance stress tips. If you want to really look into something that you can do like from a self-help perspective, if you hop onto YouTube, definitely on Google, but if you might hop onto YouTube and you search the words cognitive diffusion, and do a little bit of reading and watching into that as a concept, I think you can apply cognitive diffusion as a concept self-help wise like pretty readily. It's a way of helping you to not take your stress-inducing thoughts as seriously. So step one would be like identify what thoughts are you having that are making you feel really, really stressed, and then use cognitive diffusion as a skill to kind of not take those thoughts as seriously. How do you turn your brain off at night? Can't sleep. Can't really turn your brain off. I mean, you can do things that set you up for having better luck sleeping, right? So obviously, try to keep the exact same sleep-wake time schedule. Try to get intensive exercise early on in the day to tire yourself out. Don't drink caffeine. Don't drink alcohol, right? Like you can try and do all these things that give you a better chance. But normally your brain's still going to be on. What I recommend to people is put on something like really, really slow, really calm instrumental music, and pick just one element of the instrumental music. So maybe there's guitar and piano and whatever. Pick one instrument and just like focus all of your attention on that. And then every time your brain like starts overthinking things, going through anxious thought cycles, just redirect it to that one instrument that you've picked and just try to do that like over and over again until eventually you fall asleep. That's like a first line strategy that I give to people, and for quite a lot of people it helps. So I like to give that one out. But also get a sleep study done. They're not that much work to do, and for a lot of people they can be like life-changing. Is CBD an option for someone with bad social anxiety? Look, some GPs here in Australia prescribe cannabis for for everything. So maybe. But you probably get like non-THC loaded CBD oil and try it. I think that's one of those things we can probably try. There's probably not too many downside effects, but like talk to your doctor. What would I suggest for someone who has ADHD and comorbidities like anxiety and depression? What medication class is the most effective? So for ADHD, you can medicate through either stimulants or non-stimulants. When it comes to depression and anxiety, depression is a lot more of a mixed bag. Obviously, there's a lot of antidepressant type medications, many, many different types of like SSRIs. For anxiety, you've got a lot of different types of anxiolytics. With anxiety, you typically don't want to be medicating it long term. A lot of the most popular, common anxiolytic drugs are things where, they basically tell people like, look, don't take this every day. Things like diazepams, all of like the benzo class of medications, like they're not great for long-term use. So generally you would much prefer to resolve it through like behavioral or cognitive therapy if you can. Could self-administered EMDR be effective? For some people, yes. For some people, it makes it worse. On the whole, it's not indicated. So indicated means like recommended and efficacious. So if you look at the research, they tested to see like could people do self-administered EMDR, and if you weighed up the pros and cons, it looked like it wasn't good. It's not a good idea to recommend it to people. Seems like either the effects aren't as good, because obviously a big chunk of EMDR therapy is like the therapist guiding you through it and picking up on physical signs of like when you should stop processing, when you should start, what you should focus on. You can't really do that yourself. Also, being in the presence of someone that you trust is really, really helpful for, in the process of habituating a trauma. So it just seems like self-administered EMDR is not like very effective, and for some people can make things worse because then they expose themselves to too large of a dose of trauma without like appropriate containment strategies. You're unemployed. How do you not appear desperate in an interview? This is one of those things where practice. There's no other solution than practice. Because internally, you are going to be desperate, and you're not going to be able to like gaslight yourself into thinking that you're not. You will be desperate. Practice. If it's in front of a mirror, so be it. If it's you recording yourself, so be it. Practice with a friend, and I really recommend recording your sessions. So whether you practice with yourself or you practice with a friend, record it, watch the recording, do it again. Pick up on the things where you're like, oh, I didn't like my body posture, I didn't like my vocal tone. Record it, watch it again, record it, watch it again, record it, watch it again. How long does it take to build a habit? Depends on a few things. So people will say things like, 30 days to build a habit. That's not true. What it is when you do an action, how much of a reward do you get from doing that, and how immediately do you get that reward? If there's a really big delay between doing something and a reward, you may never build a habit for doing it. If you do something and the reward is really, really small, you may never build a habit out of doing it. If you do something, the reward's fairly small, but you get it immediately, you can build a habit fairly quickly. Say that might be something like drinking a Diet Coke. You drink a Diet Coke, it's not an enormous shot of heroin into your veins. It's like a small reward, but you get it instantly. You get the caffeine, you get like the sweet flavors, instant. So if you do that like for 30 days in a row, you'll probably build a habit of drinking Diet Coke. So it depends on like how big of a dosage of reward you're getting and how immediately following the action do you get it. The higher those both things are, the quicker it is to build a habit. How do I feel about alcohol usage for anxiety? Definitely works for some people as a short-term solution, tends to, on the whole, make things significantly worse in the medium to long term, and the health trade-offs generally don't seem to be worth it. There are some people who use it for like, as essentially like a parties, right? Like they go to parties, they will drink, that helps them loosen up and enjoy the thing, and then they don't really drink outside of that, and it doesn't affect their life outside of that. And for those people, honestly, it's probably indicated like it's probably a really good idea. But, again, not for everybody. And if you begin using alcohol for a crutch, like regularly, like this is a multiple times a week type thing or daily type thing, like the cons are just going to pile up so quickly that whatever benefit you were getting from it is going to be diminishing really quickly. Can you be neurotypical after receiving a diagnosis for ADHD? So, like, definitionally, not really. If we think about, like, neurotypical is essentially just a definitional category. So we bucket people into two buckets. We go, hey, people in this bucket, they're neurodivergent. People in this bucket are neurotypical. And then you argue over who belongs in what category. But generally speaking, colloquially, we say that people with like ADHD, people with autism, people with like aphantasia, these people fall into the neurodivergent category. People without them are neurotypical. And then you have other things like, OCD, where people are fighting over where does this belong. Maybe personality disorders. Some people will fight over where this belongs, right? But like ADHD and autism are squarely like the term neurodivergent is not a diagnostic term. It's just like a social term. So over time, language and meanings will change as culture evolves. But at the moment, with our culture, with our language use, if you have ADHD, you fall into the neurodivergent bucket. That's not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just a definition thing. Is it true trying to communicate with someone who barely communicates won't cause any change? On average, I would say that is true. Most of the time, if you want to change somebody, communication has to go both ways, but that's not always the case. I remember I had a coworker, and he was telling me that, he had this teenager client that he was seeing, And this teenager client was essentially just like never talk to him. But, you know, what he would do is he'd just like grab a footy and they would just like pass the footy back and forth. And while they did that, my client, who was like in the role of a therapist, he would just talk and he would talk. And then they would do that for like each session for a few months, right? And the teenager would like barely reply, but he would just talk and they'd pass the footy back and forth. And then after like a few months, you know, things were actually like getting a lot better for the teenager, and things had changed. And, you know, the teenager kind of came to him and he said, you know, like, hey, I really appreciated like when you said this and this and this and this. And so he was actually like receptive and he was listening to everything that this guy was saying. It's just this guy, the guy who was a therapist, he had no clue. So there are cases where, you know, you can talk and the other person won't, but it does make an impact. That's not usual. I would say that's like the exception rather than the rule, but it can happen that way. Look in my general server. All right. Would I like 1 million beers? That guy has the most... I love the GigaChad filter. Fantastic. Unfortunately for me, I can't use the GigaChad filter. It just shows me my regular face. I don't know what's wrong with it. How to focus better with ADHD. There's two reliable ways to improve focus with ADHD. One of them is very efficacious and has a ton of research. The other is slightly efficacious and has a moderate amount of research. So the most effective way to improve ADHD that has the most research is with stimulant medication. The second way to improve focus that has a low amount of effect, an effect, not zero effect, like a low amount, low, medium, high, right? Like a low amount of effect, but has a decent amount of research behind it, is mindfulness-based intervention for ADHD. So MBI, ADHD, mindfulness-based intervention for ADHD, has a moderate amount of evidence and a low effect. Not none, low effect. Stimulants are the best though. How do you fix body dysmorphia? People call you pretty, but you only see your flaws. How do you fix this? So body dysmorphia falls under a category of disorders that we call OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders. So there's obsessions, so thoughts that you have in your mind, and then you have compulsions, so behaviors that you do in relation to these obsessions. And the disorder is because these obsessions and these compulsions are like damaging to your psyche or to your life. There's functional impairment. Body dysmorphia is a type of OCD. So the treatments that work for OCD work for body dysmorphia. So what works for OCD? Can someone in the chat answer this? I was going over this topic 2 days ago. So was anyone here 2 days ago? Can you guys remember what works for OCD? Who can tell me in the chat? Correct. Ding, 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 ding. ERP in the chat. Yes. ERP works for body dysmorphia because body dysmorphia is a form of OCD. Exposure response prevention. It is a type of CBT, a type of cognitive behavioral therapy that has been specifically altered to work optimally for OCD. There are some, if you look at like standard CBT, there are some things like some core techniques of CBT that don't work for OCD and would actually make it a little bit worse or just be ineffective. And so what they did is they took CBT and they altered CBT to make it very specifically work for OCD, and they came up with ERP. So ERP will work for body dysmorphia. Find a therapist that's trained in it. What is the difference between a psychologist and a psychiatrist? So a psychiatrist can administer medication and they've gone through medical school. Psychologists generally have not gone through medical school, and unless you're in some funky state in the United States, psychologists do not prescribe medication. We work through psychotherapy. We help people with understanding their mind, their psyche, their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors, and their choices, and to essentially sort those things out to be better. Psychiatrists generally manage medication, prescribe medication, and some of them on the rare occasion will do psychotherapy. Very rare though, because when you can bill $650 for a 15-minute session, why would you spend an hour with a person? Doesn't make a sense. How do I study psychology as a 17-year-old? You really love the topic, sorry to ask. So there's a ton of really good free resources online for psychology. There's entire lecture series online. The best one, hands down, if you want an introduction to psychology and behavioral evolution, search Robert Rebert, Sapolsky, Sapolsky. He has an entire Stanford series of lectures on YouTube. It's about 13 videos long. It's his entire course that he teaches at Stanford. Fantastic introduction to behavioral psychology and behavioral evolution. Really, really good. He's probably one of the best lecturers that I've ever listened to. He's engaging, he's funny, he knows when to go on a tangent, when to stop. He's brilliant. Go and watch that if you want an introduction. How effective is neurofeedback for ADHD? Not effective. The research on this is clear. Year after year after year, more and more reviews come out about neurofeedback. It's just not effective for ADHD. For those who don't know, neurofeedback, there's various forms of it, but in some way they will measure something about your biology and then try to get you to change your attention on what you're focusing on and then give you feedback based on that. So for example, one form is a person will like watch a computer screen and they'll have a headband strapped to their head, and the headband will measure blood oxygenation levels in their prefrontal cortex. So when they're focusing, the hypothesis is that oxygenation levels will be very, very high. So, they watch like a movie on the screen, and then when they're not focusing, the movie will stop because the headband's connected to the computer. And then they have to focus again to get the movie to play. And the idea is they get this immediate feedback. The movie plays when they're focusing and stops when they're not. So they should get really, really good at controlling their attention, right? That's the hypothesis. What happens in reality is that people just get really good at doing neurofeedback. And then when it comes to the real world, zero functional performance boost. They don't get better at doing anything else. They just get better at doing neurofeedback. And the evidence is really clear on this. For like the past decade, every single year, more research comes out. There's only one branch of research that supports neurofeedback. And guess who conducts that research? It's the people who sell the neurofeedback kits. When they do the research, then all of a sudden, like, wow, look at the benefits of neurofeedback. Yeah. There's no form of neurofeedback that shows real world improvements. It's like borderline a scam. If someone shows me a form of neurofeedback where the research is done by someone who isn't selling the bloody equipment, and then the benefits, not only do they get better at neurofeedback, but like their life improves, I'll be all aboard. I'll set one up in my office, I'll buy a neurofeedback kit, and I'll begin advertising that I provide neurofeedback. Until that evidence exists, it's charlatanry. What do I think about the use of ibogaine in clinical and therapeutic settings? All I know about ibogaine is from when I was in like 2015 and used to listen to Joe Rogan, and he would talk about ibogaine, or he would have guests on talking about how ibogaine is a magical cure for smoking and heroin use, and sounded pretty dope. I have done zero like research into it beyond that. So if what I heard on Joe Rogan was correct, every doctor should be pinging ibogaine like it's exercise and sunlight, because I heard it's amazing. Look, I'm probably if I go do a Google search, it's probably going to be that shuts down your kidneys or something. There has to be a reason it's not widely prescribed, and I don't buy into the big pharma is evil, because that it'd be popular in some country, right? Surely, I don't know. I could be wrong though. And addiction psychiatry is not my area of specialty, so. Is it bad to think too much about yourself? Generally, you don't want to think like a ton about yourself. You want to be focusing on other things. If you're just sitting there like eternally reflecting upon yourself, that doesn't really get you super far. But like some people love doing it as a form of like introspective meditation. I'm sure there's been like monks and yogis in India who've just sat on a hill thinking about themselves for 100 years. Oh. As with all things, this is the framework that I use, right? When you guys ask, like, is it good or is it bad to be doing a certain thing? The real question you should be asking is, when I do this certain thing, does it make my life better or does it make my life worse? And if this is the only framework that you guys need to use when you analyze these types of questions. You did 20 hours of neurofeedback, and it does show improvement. Brain was scanned before and after. You can see it. I'm a first responder, and neurofeedback was the best. Cool. All I'm saying is that the research is abundantly clear. When people do neurofeedback, they get better at doing neurofeedback. So they would get certain scores from the neurofeedback, and then afterwards, they would get much higher scores on the neurofeedback. They get better at doing neurofeedback. They improve essentially according to placebo, but they don't outperform placebo in terms of real-world application. Is it possible that you are the exception to that? Sure. I can imagine a world in which there are some people for whom neurofeedback actually provides real-world performance. But for the vast majority of people, as panned out by the literature, that's just not the case, so it's not an indicated treatment for ADHD. Maybe for people without ADHD, for whom neurofeedback hasn't been as well studied, maybe for them it actually does provide real-world benefit. But as a treatment for ADHD, it's not a thing. Best BPD treatment. So I'm going to answer this twice because I don't know what people mean by BPD. For bipolar disorder, the best treatments are medication for the mania and psychotherapy for the depression. For borderline personality disorder, the best treatments are psychotherapy. Specifically, there are a few types of treatments that are pretty good for borderline personality disorder. Originally, all we had for BPD was dialectical behavioral therapy. That was really the only thing that showed evidence in the beginning. And to this day, it's still the gold standard treatment. It's still really, really good. It's the one that I tend to recommend to people. I think it's a fantastic form of cognitive behavioral therapy. Dialectical behavioral therapy, really good. Now we've also got pretty good, whoa, that was meant to be an S. We've got pretty good evidence for schema therapy for borderline personality disorder. Schema therapy, where dialectical behavioral therapy is a lot more focused on skill building, as it were. So like how to handle your emotions, how to talk to people in a way that maintains and builds relationships rather than crumbling them, how to manage distress, how to do all these things, skill building, right? And distress tolerance and such, and emotional control. Schema therapy goes kind of more so to your thoughts and like how you conceptualize yourself, how you conceptualize relationships, how you conceptualize other people, what your childhood experiences, like how they shaped your brain and your way of like perceiving categories of things. And it looks to try to change those so that you have a healthier outlook on the world. Two actually kind of different approaches between these therapies, but they're both as efficacious. So, you know, probably what will end up working best is a combination of the two. But for now, these are the two gold standards for treating borderline personality disorder. I have anxiety, but I can't tolerate SSRIs. Yep, a lot of side effects for a lot of people. For some people, they're pretty helpful. For others, not. Generally with anxiety, like I was saying before, most anxiolytic medications are not things to be on long-term. Doctors will tell you that. Generally, you want to treat it with a combination of like psychotherapy. Well, actually, psychotherapy covers everything, but like psychotherapy, you want to be doing environmental changes, personal changes, cognitive changes, managing your thoughts, managing your feelings, learning to tolerate distress, doing exposure therapy, like all these things, you want to combine them together. There are, for some, this won't be a panacea for everyone though, right? There are a subset of people for whom they will need anxiolytic medication to function perhaps for the rest of their life. I think that's a very small amount of people, very, very small indeed. But for some people, like, they were born into the world and Jesus Christ, their brain just decided it hated them. And that sucks. They can still do things that improve it. So instead of like, you know, being at the pinnacle of anxiety all the time, yeah, they might be here, but they might still have constant anxiety. But that's better than being maxed out all the time. Why is trauma still massively impacting you every day? I just can't cope with it. So when we think about the word trauma, right? Take it in the purest form. A trauma is a wound. So a physical trauma, like if you get hit by a car and you got an open wound, you got an open trauma, right? Psychological trauma is a wound of the mind. Wounds will keep hurting until they are healed, or they'll keep creating effects until they are healed. So a psychological trauma, hopefully you would think would heal itself. And generally the brain has a really good way of healing itself. For most people, most traumas they suffer don't remain traumas. They are wounds that exist in the short term, and their brain processes the event and works towards healing itself. And it's pretty good at doing that. But for some people, that trauma kind of gets stuck a little bit, or it festers, or it spreads as an infection, or it wounds over as like a scar that doesn't heal properly. And so you've got to do something to address it. And typically that means opening the wound back up so you can properly clean it out and heal it. So sometimes for some people, when the wound has festered, you kind of have to go through a bit of pain and reopening it so that you can actually clear out the gunk and seal it up properly. My Thara Maroon. I've seen a lot of research on neurofeedback. A lot. I haven't browsed like one paper on it. I've seen a lot of research on it. And I've discussed it a lot with a lot of people. I don't doubt that neurofeedback worked well for you. I can tell that you have a lot of conviction in what you're saying. I believe that it worked for you. I also very strongly am stating that the current bulk body of research that isn't bought and paid for by the people selling the neurofeedback kits demonstrates that it does not produce real world outcomes for the vast majority of people who engage in it. Do I have to memorize a lot? Kind of yes and kind of no. So yes, in the sense that like you do need to memorize like what to do, but it's not like I sit here with like flashcards, like rote memorizing things. I read about or I listen about concepts or I talk about concepts or I get taught concepts and then I practice them. And it's through that practicing and using them that they kind of become ingrained in my mind. Like when people ask, like if people were to ask me like, when did I learn about X concept or Y concept? I wouldn't be able to tell you. It's just, it's a constant flow of information. So no part of like my job is like me memorizing flashcards. It's just doing the job, talking to clients, and occasionally when I talk to clients, thoughts will come into my head like, oh, this is a good moment to use like this style of questioning or this type of technique or ask about like this category of things. And then once I do that, then that skill is more ingrained because I've actually used it. NF is neurofeedback. So neurofeedback is a style of therapy where they measure some kind of thing of your biology and they map it to some type of other behavior. So we were talking about if neurofeedback as a therapy type was effective for ADHD, and I was just basically saying that no. Not based on the research. Psychologists can't prescribe medication, psychiatrists can. One last haha, writing from Australia. You're about to start EMDR for a small T trauma. If this doesn't work, should I try TMS? Transcranial magnetic stimulation? I don't know if I've seen research showing that TMS works for traumatypic symptoms. It might be out there. I just haven't seen anything on it. I don't particularly keep up to date with the TMS research literature. The last I heard about it is they were using it to try to treat major depressive disorders, and it was looking promising, but more data was needed. If EMDR doesn't work, there's some other types of things you can use. I think one of the realities that I think people need to know about is that psychotherapies are kind of like medications. There are many types of medications for each particular illness, and for some people, like some won't work, right? There's many different types of antibiotics, and for some people, they'll try one and it just won't work. That's reality. There's many different types of antidepressant medications. For some people, some will work. Others, they need to cycle through many different types to find the one that works for them. Psychotherapies are the same. There's many different types of therapy. You have things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. You have things like ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, DBT. You have psychodynamic therapy. You have things like Gestalt therapy. You have psychoanalysis. You have EMDR, you have inner family systems, you have family systems therapy, you have cognitive processing therapy, you have like art therapy, you have narrative therapy, you have the list goes on. You have person-centered therapy, you have motivational interviewing. There's a lot of different types of therapy. And the reality is you kind of just have to hope that you find the one that works for you. Now, having said that, you're not like purely throwing darts. Some therapies are more evidence-based and tend to be better for certain types of conditions, right? Like if you have, let me think of something. If you have chronic pain, probably like family systems therapy isn't gonna probably do fuck all for you. So you kind of figure out like what's your problem, and then you match it to like a couple of different types of therapies that have the most evidence for that problem, and then you kind of just have to trial them out. For trauma and trauma-typic symptoms, the therapies that tend to be the most evidence-based, I'm not going to say the best, because who knows, the best could change. The ones that have the most evidence are cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, which is a form of CBT. They're all forms of CBT. Cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, EMDR. Written exposure therapy is emerging, but seems pretty good. That's like tier 1 type treatments. Below that, you have things like acceptance and commitment therapy, inner family systems. Yeah, so I'd say these are like the most evidence-based, the second most evidence-based, and then below that you might get into like more experimental things. So this is where you have like somatic experiencing, yeah. So kind of, yeah. But generally you want to try things from this category first and then move down the order. You don't want to be trying, it's like medications, right? If they were like, hey, you've got this infection, this drug works for like 80% of people. You wouldn't be like, no, give me that experimental shit that just came out last week and has like worked on 1 in 10 people. Yeah, you start with the thing that works for the most people first, and then you try the experimental medication at the end. Why do psychologists prescribe CBT for everything? Well, roughly can be for 2 reasons. One is that almost anything falls under the banner of CBT when you think about it. Cognitive, so things that happen in your mind. Behavioral, so things that you do with your actions. Therapy. Every form of therapy is CBT when you really think about it. Right? Tell me a form of therapy that isn't. It's like, well, what about psychoanalysis? And you sit there and you talk. Well, hey, look, are you doing things with your mind? Yes, that's cognitions. Are you making behavioral changes based on that? Yeah, most of the time. Well, sounds like CBT to me. Right? So that's the first reason, is people just, anything can really broadly be categorized as CBT. The second reason is that CBT is what is most widely taught in universities. And when you talk to doctors, so people like general practitioners, family doctors, they don't know about a lot of other therapies other than CBT, because the mental health modules that they get in medical school and whatever are not super in depth. And they'll basically be like, look, you're a general practitioner. It's not your job to do psychotherapy, but you should refer people to a trained psychotherapist. And CBT has a lot of evidence. So the GPs, they write down their notes and they go, okay, CBT. And so then people come and see them. They say, doc, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling that in my head. I'm not feeling good. Doc says, what did I get taught? CBT. And so it's kind of a perpetuating cycle from there on. What do I think about the use of ibogaine? Don't know enough about it. Thoughts on acceptance and commitment therapy. I love acceptance and commitment therapy for certain issues. Acceptance and commitment therapy, for those who don't know, is normally called ACT, ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. ACT posits that there are essentially 3 important things for psychological well-being. Thing number 1, being in the present moment. So get out of your head, stop overthinking things, right? Like, be in the present moment. Notice what's happening. Stop thinking about your past, stop thinking about the future. What is happening right now? Be in the present moment. Diffusion. Decouple from your thoughts, decouple from your feelings, decouple from your sensations. So present moment awareness of what's happening. Diffusion is a decoupling. You have your thoughts, you have your feelings, but they are not you. You observe them, but you don't need to let them control you. The third thing that's important in ACT is values-guided action. So with what you're doing in the present moment, does it line up with your values and what you want as a human being? Right? If you're doing things that you don't value, day in, day out, you're going to be psychologically unwell. If you're doing things that you do value day in, day out, you're going to be moving towards psychological wellness. ACT is an awesome framework. Awesome framework. I'm a big fan of it. What do I think is the best medication for adult ADHD? So generally speaking, ADHD medication falls into two types. Type number 1, we have the stimulant classes. Type number 2, we have the non-stimulant classes. So within type number 2, mostly what we have are alpha 2A agonists. So these are generally medications that we prescribe for like heart issues and things like this, but it slows down kind of the physical activation. So for people who have a lot of physical hyperactivity or sometimes hyperactivity of the mind, these work reasonably well. They're all right. The other type of non-stimulants are SNRI? SNDRI? Things like atomoxetine. Wait, I'm checking the spelling of checking the spelling of this. Yeah, SNRI, ATOMEX. Yeah, SNRI. So things like atomoxetine. These are both non-stimulant classes of medication, and they work pretty well. Within the stimulant classes of medication, we have the classics. So we have methylphenidate, better known as Ritalin. We also, good lord, Ritalin. We also have the amphetamine salts. So these are things like Adderall. Some of the more brand names that you guys might be familiar with. So we got things like Ritalin, we got like Vyvanse, we have things like Concerta, right? Anyway, stimulants and non-stimulants. Broadly speaking, people get started on stimulant medications because they tend to produce effects really, really quickly, whereas non-stimulants you might need to be on for a couple of weeks before you notice effect. Generally with stimulants, you stop taking them and they're out of your system within a day. Side effects stop. Non-stimulants, again, the side effects, if they're there, might take a while to go away. So generally people start on the stimulants. If they cycle through them and none of them work, they move over to the non-stimulants. That's normally the way it works. When it comes to how much effect do they produce, how good are they basically, short term really varies person to person. On the average, they're all equally as effective. Long term, due to issues with side effects and long-term outcomes, atomoxetine seems to produce better outcomes than things like guanfacine and clonidine, which are alpha-2A agonists. So atomoxetine seems to outperform guanfacine and clonidine long-term due to issues with like less side effects. But long-term stimulant use and atomoxetine use appear to be relatively equal and even. The chat box is blocking my text. Oh, God, okay. Well, you guys are going to have to imagine what is in my text then. Hi, Dante. How do I begin to heal myself from long-term effects of BPD and CPTSD? So if we think about like what works in therapy, so if we're not talking about a specific type of therapy, but we're just talking about like what works. So generally we want to see like what are the mechanisms that work, right? So we want to see cognitive changes in the form of like perception of self and perception of the world, right? So if from trauma we think that the world is a terrible place, we want to, and the world actually isn't a terrible place. You're not living in the middle of like a violent hellhole. You have escaped and you're in a safer place, right? We want to change these perceptions so that they are not insanely horrible and they match reality. We want to see behavioral changes. So we want to get rid of we want to remove self-limiting behaviors. So we're going to be doing things after experiencing trauma that are fairly self-limiting. So maybe we don't trust people, so we don't interact with people, so we never make friends, we never make relationships, and we get more and more isolated. Self-limiting behaviors. We want to kind of stop those. The third thing we want to do is desensitize our traumatic triggers. So say, for example, you get run over by a red car, you're really, really traumatized. Now, whenever you see a car or you see the color red, you like have a panic attack and you freeze up and you're overwhelmed. And this is just debilitating. You can't live life. You go anywhere near a fire station and your heart explodes, right? Unfeasible. You can't live life like this. We want to desensitize triggers. So things like exposure therapy are really, really good at this. It's what exposure therapies were built for. So when you think about the mechanisms of change, you should be able to work through most of these in most forms of gold standard trauma therapy. So when you think about cognitive processing therapy, it should result in a lot of these changes. When you think about things like prolonged exposure therapy or EMDR, it'll work on all of these things. Generally, any gold standard trauma therapy will address these things. If you want to start working on it yourself, pick one of these things that you think you can do by yourself. Probably not this one. This is not recommended to do by yourself. You can probably start doing some of these. You can probably start doing some of these. And then when you go to therapy, tell them what you've tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what are the roadblocks you faced, and you can kind of like speed up the therapeutic process, even if by a little bit. My box. Come back, box. What's the difference between a psychologist, therapist, and psychiatrist? I've got a video on that on my channel. What are my thoughts on FND? So for those who do not know, FND stands for Functional Neurological Disorder. This is basically where something is happening in your brain that is then creating physical symptoms. So maybe, for example, seizures or partial paralysis or difficulties talking, right? So create some kind of physical symptoms due to something coming from the brain. There's a functional impairment from something in the brain, and we have no idea why. This is why it's FND. So say, for example, you have a stroke and it's in a very particular brain region that controls your capacity to output speech. We say you have Broca's aphasia because the blood clot in the Broca's area of the brain. We know what's happening. It's cool. If something's happening in the brain and we literally don't know, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't diagnose people with FND. But if you work in a hospital and you're like a neuro psych or a neuro specialist, and someone's having something that's clearly coming from the brain and you have no idea why, you go, congratulations, you have the fun label of FND. And that's what FND is, folks. What are my thoughts on it? It exists. It's a category of diagnosable disorder to bucket the things that we haven't identified the cause of yet. What are some of the coolest recent advancements in the field of psychology? So psychology as a general field has very few breakthroughs. Instead, we have advancement by increment by increment by increment. And the reason for this is actually primarily an ethical one. Imagine that you have a group of people, right? There's a whole bunch of people. We've got a group of people, and these people all have like significant mental health issues, right? And you go, I want to develop a new treatment to help these people. We've already got this treatment and it results in like plus 10 mental health points when they do this. And these people need these plus 10 points because they're like on the borderline of collapsing into a puddle. If you go, hey, I've got this brand new treatment, I don't know if this does plus 100 or like minus 3,000. No idea. Never tried it before. This could be a gigantic breakthrough, but we can't test this. Ethically, it's wrong. Like, to do an experiment, what you would have to do is divide these people into two experimental groups and be like, okay, some of you get the plus 10, some of you get the experimental one, and let's see like what the outcomes are on the end, right? But you can't do this. What if people go into this experimental group and they just get like mad fucked up? You can't do it. So because of that, what we do is we take treatments that already work, like this plus 10, and we go, okay, I'm going to try this new therapy. It's a little bit different. I'm going to put like a nice little hat on it. We've made some differences to this therapy. And now I hypothesize that this will either be like minus 11 or plus 11. So it might be a little bit better. And then we increment and we increment and we increment and we get better and better over time with our therapies. But that's why there's no like major advancements in psychological like therapies. It's all incremental based. But for most people, even most people in psychology who are not therapists, they don't know this. Because as therapists, like say for example, you get trained in like EMDR. Every single year, the EMDR Institute publishes a new essentially like textbook or like treatment manual for EMDR therapists that has like updated information in it on like changes to make to the treatment process to make it a little bit more effective. So like each year on year, it gets like a little bit more effective, a little bit better, right? And so if you compare like treatment now of like CBT now to CBT 20 years ago, it looks a lot different, but it's like many, many incremental changes. And so that's why like in psychology, there's not generally like big breakthroughs, but we do have like steady progress over time, which is pretty cool. What's the process of clinical trials for psychology? All of my experiences is in bio and genetics. So there's a few different main experimental designs. We have like proper like randomized control trials, right? Where you control against placebo, you control against treatment as usual. You have things that are just like experimental designs. There's no like randomization, but like it's an experiment. I'm just going to put EXP. You have things that are like quasi-experimental, where it's kind of an experiment, but, you know, it's a bit sketchy. Then we have things that are like cohort studies. So a group of people just got one type of therapy. How did they go? And then we have things that are just like case studies. Right? There's probably a few other different types of studies. I'm just not going to write them all down. So in a randomized control trial, you'll have like two, like let's say, for example, two different types of therapies. You've got one group of people, you would randomly allocate them to the thing, and you'd see like which one outperformed. And you can have as many different categories of treatment. You could have treatment as usual, you could have a placebo, you could have new therapy, you could have new therapy plus we stab the person with a knife at the end of it, right? Like you could have all these different groups and see what performs the best. In an experiment, you just take two or more groups of things and you put them head to head, but you don't randomize. There's no randomization, so you can have a lot of other factors that bias the data. For example, if you only take really willing participants and you put them into group one, and you put only really unwilling participants into group two, and then you go, wow, group one performed so much better, this therapy is so much better. It's like, no, the participants were more willing. So randomization is important. Cohort studies can be really, really cool. Case studies are really good for like pilots. So for example, when you do create a new type of therapy, you don't want to administer it to 100 people because what if it fucks them up? So you administer it to like one person who's willing to take some experimental treatment, and then you write a case study about it and you go, hey guys, this is my new type of thing. Here's the person, here's what happened, here's the results. Or it can be really good to take an existing therapy and write up a case study about it, to go really in depth in a very complex case so that clinicians can learn from that. So aside from diagnosis, what is different with psychologists, the PACFA and ACA counselors? So the main difference between, so counselors don't diagnose in Australia, psychologists can. Psychologists can also administer psychometric testing. In terms of psychotherapy, they'll broadly treat the same. I don't know if counselors get Medicare rebates. They might, but psychologists get Medicare rebates. Generally, what you're talking about, though, is level of regulation. So there's a lot more regulation for psychology, there's a lot higher standards, and there's a lot more repercussions if we don't follow them. So you're getting someone who's just more regulated generally. How do you do a placebo treatment for therapy? Yeah, so what you can do, for example, you might have one type of therapy where they come in, cognitive behavioral therapy, and we explore the person's thoughts and their feelings and their behaviors, and we try to make some changes. In the placebo control, they would just come in and we just sit there and we talk about the footy. So we're controlling to see if just talking to someone, that's the placebo, right? And the person thinks, well, I'm talking to a therapist. If he wants to talk about the footy, it must be because he thinks it's therapeutic, right? So the placebo would just be not doing therapy, it'd just be talking, right? But with a therapist still, so the person still thinks they're getting therapy. I am a generally registered psychologist with no specific area of endorsement. You're entering a psych course and a unit description mentions the dark triad. Isn't stuff like that superficial? Stuff like that isn't really diagnosable, but like it's used enough in like pop culture, and there are researchers who do things on like dark triad, dark tetrad, those types of things. It's fine. It's not like an super invalid concept or whatever, although they have expanded it. So originally we had the good old dark triad, and what that was, what was it? Psychopathy, Machiavellianism, lack of empathy. Anyway, there were like 3 traits: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and callousness. Was that the dark triad? And then they expanded it into the dark tetrad. So then they added in, I think, like sadism and something else as well. So like essentially like 5 personality characteristics that we don't really like to see in people. There's research on it. It seems like you can kind of group some people into those categories. I don't know if it's like clinically helpful. It doesn't seem like it. That's why no clinician really talks about it. But you can learn about it. Why not? Won't counselors be regulated soon? Nope. There is no push from any governing body to regulate counselors. It's the same like the difference between the term nutritionist and dietitian. Dietitian is a regulated term. These people are like trained, regulated. They have high degrees of standardized training. They have a lot of consequences to their work if they mess things up. A nutritionist, though, mate, they'll chuck you onto whatever diet they want. Is it emotional abuse when someone ghosts you and never talks to you again without any explanation? I wouldn't consider that emotional abuse. For me, the word, is it emotionally painful? Like, yes. I consider like the word abuse, we use it to describe like patterns of behavior. So if you like see a person one time, like technically, yes, the word abuse can apply to like one-time things. Like he abused me. He walked up to me and punched me and I never saw him again. Linguistically that flows all right, but generally when we're using the word abuse, we're using it to signify that something was happening over a long period of time. There was like a pattern of behavior. So if they like ghost you and you never see them again, it's kind of like you could consider it like an emotional wound, or they were rude to you, or like that's not a nice thing to do, but I wouldn't use the word abuse. What are my thoughts on educational psychologists? Yeah, they're cool. So educational psychologists are people who have chosen, or in Australia we call them ed and dev psychologists, education and developmental psychologists. So they're people who have chosen to specialize in working with like essentially people in the developmental stages of life. So children up until, you could argue 16, you could argue 18, you could argue maybe 20. But people in the early stages of life, as well as the education sphere. So helping students to, get through school, to make accommodations so that they can demonstrate their best performance. I think it's a needed profession. We need trained people in schools who can work with kids really well. Yep, seems good. How do I feel about self-diagnosis? I actually quite like it when clients, before they've come to see me, have done like a bunch of like reading or whatever, and then they come in and they say, hey, I think I've got like these things going on. Because generally speaking, people are not dumb. They've done reading. They can match up symptoms. They're not always getting it correct, but at the very least, they're pointing towards something that rapidly identifies a lot of their struggles that they're having. And it can save us actually quite a lot of time. Is self-diagnosis always like accurate? No, like certainly not. But when people come in, they're like, hey, look, I think I have social anxiety disorder. And I'm like, okay, tell me more. Like, why do you think you have that? And they're like, well, blah, 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 blah. Like they will be prepared. And I think the act of like trying to self-diagnose means that you have to become more informed about what's going on for you. And you have to be more introspective about what's going on for you because you become curious about your own condition. And I think that's really, really cool because then when people come to me with that self-diagnosis, we can then explore that. And generally, if I say, hey, look, I actually don't think it's this, I think it's this, no one has ever thrown a stink about it. They're just like, oh, cool. Like people just want to have answers. I think there's nothing wrong with like self-exploration. Obviously, like I don't think that means you should go and like self-medicate or whatever. But I think if you're doing it prior to engaging in therapy, it can be really helpful. Because you spend that time introspecting, becoming aware of your own symptoms and your thoughts and whatever, and then that gives you information that you can work with your therapist. I should be on Joe Rogan. Dude, can you imagine? It'd be amazing. I could get high as a kite, lose my registration. What's my favorite psychology book to explain how the brain works? Oh, I don't know if I have one for that. It comes back to an answer that I gave earlier that a lot of the information I have is like amalgamated from so many different sources that it's not like one book. Yeah. I think there's like quite a few like cool videos that I've seen and cool books that I've read where they like pull together, and I think they're really nice. Yeah, I don't know if I have like one good book. What are my thoughts? What uni did I go to? I don't know if answering that like doxes me. Does that? I have no idea. I have no idea. What are my thoughts on dealing with grief and loss of a relationship or finding acceptance? I think the main thing to think about here is, while the stages of grief are not actually like chronological, right? So you don't work through, it's like denial, bargaining, anger, sadness, acceptance. Not everyone works through them chronologically. They are phases of grief that most people do actually oscillate between, right? And I think it's perfectly fine to be patient with yourself as long as you feel that oscillation. If you feel yourself like trapped in one stage of grief for a really, really long time, that's probably an indication that you need to get some external support to help you move through that. But as long as you're oscillating, generally you're going to like be moving closer and closer to spending more time in the acceptance phase overall. Like that movement itself indicates processing. Sprechen de Deutsch? No. I do not sprechen de Deutsch. Let's see, am I missing any questions from anywhere? No. Just so you guys are aware as well, my Discord, the link to join my Discord is in my profile. The link tree is there. You click the link tree, join the Discord. There's a dedicated Q&A channel in there. Any questions in the Q&A channel will get priority, since it's easier for me to keep up with the Discord chat and read all of that. And I'm also in the voice chat of the Discord if anyone wanted to jump in and talk about any of the things I'm talking about. If anyone has pushback on the things I'm talking about, that's cool too. I think that confrontational debate is the best way to expand a person's knowledge of where their blind spots are. And so I think that's cool. Can I provide an overview of the ADD diagnosis process for adults? Sure. So generally speaking, when we're talking about diagnosing or assessing for ADHD in adults, this is what the process normally looks like. So gold standard, best case scenario. So we do a physical check. We make sure that the symptoms aren't better explained by things like deficient like vitamins, food, minerals, hormones, whatever. Physically, we check out, all good, no brain damage, beautiful. Then we might do some background information. So if you have things like old report cards, that can be really cool. Maybe something like talking with your parents so that they can tell us like how things were for you during childhood. That can be really, really nice information to have. Generally, we'll do some standardized questionnaires. So these will be things that talk about symptoms directly of ADHD, as well as like secondary impairments that are associated with ADHD. And we see like, does your profile from answering these questionnaires look like an ADHD profile? Then we'll do a structured clinical interview. So we'll ask about questions about other mental health issues that could be causing issues with inattention, with focus, with hyperactivity. And we'll also ask about questions directly related to ADHD. So we're trying to both rule in ADHD as well as rule out everything else that could potentially be a cause, because there's a lot of things that can cause difficulties with attention, not just ADHD. Depression can cause difficulties with attention. OCD can cause difficulties with attention. Trauma can cause issues with attention, right? So the structured clinical interview aims to not just ask about like ADHD symptoms, but about many other mental health disorders to make sure that we're really accurately diagnosing what we've actually got. And then, typically there's a bit of report writing at the end where the person will look at all the results from these things, summarize them in a report and be like, based on this is my opinion. That's what a typical ADHD assessment process looks like for an adult. How does one deal with being easily overstimulated? Generally speaking, through environmental management. They call it sensory integration therapy. It's a type of therapy that proposes that it's able to help people to manage their incoming sensory stimulation better. I don't know if it works. I don't know if the evidence is good for it. That's not me knocking it or supporting it. You can look into it yourself, sensory integration therapy. I'm just not sure what the evidence is for it. I just know that at the moment, the main recommendations are environmental management. So setting up your environment in a way where you're not getting overstimulated, where the things that bring you back to a sense of regulation, you insert those more into your routine to try to stay regulated. Thoughts on EMDR for borderline personality disorder? So EMDR is not a indicated treatment for borderline personality disorder itself. A lot of people, but not all, but a lot of people with borderline personality disorder will also have trauma-typic symptoms, if not like full-blown PTSD. And the EMDR can help with these trauma-typic symptoms or with the PTSD. And then, like, let's say if this person is experiencing, 80 units of suffering from their mental health struggles, and the EMDR helps to remove the suffering from the trauma and the PTSD, maybe now they're only suffering, 40 units of suffering. You can't really quantify this, but like it can deal with a part of the problem, but it's not typically going to deal with the entire problem. I did the 4+2 route, Mr. R. Can I talk about bipolar disorder and when you should consider medication? So generally speaking, we start considering medication when the functional impairment, the damage that you're causing to yourself or other people is really like it starts to get significant, clinically significant, and the changes that you're trying to make that are non-medication based are just not like working. The main damages that come from bipolar disorder that you medicate for are during the manic phase. And typically it's damage that you do to yourself. Financial damage from like reckless spending, illness damage from like having reckless sex and getting STDs, physical damage from reckless driving or doing really reckless things that could put your life in danger, right? So when these things become prominent, that's when you consider medication. Oftentimes though, most people with bipolar disorder, the first thing they get medicated for is their depression. And the reason for this is because when they go to the psychiatrist, they don't go when they're feeling good and manic. They go when they're feeling depressed. So they get medicated for depression. And it is often years after first contact with a mental health professional before they actually get diagnosed with bipolar, because this often takes years before they disclose to the mental health professional that they experience symptoms of mania. Thomas Wong, psychology doesn't work for me. It's just another field to make money. That's all. Around 50 new research articles being published every single week would probably disagree with you. Not that it doesn't work for you. Seems like you've had experiences with it where it did not work for you. I very much believe you. On the average, on the whole, when you look at research that tests going to therapy versus not going to therapy, people going to therapy get significantly better. Do you need to pay your boss now to get a job? Yeah, the job market is kind of in a weird place, right? Like on one hand, the unemployment statistic is really, really low. On the other hand, so many jobs that you post that aren't just like minimum wage places are, entry level job, $2 above minimum wage. We need 20 years of experience. Bizarre. My general advice to people is if you can network with people, that's generally the best. Not everyone has opportunities to like network and get jobs through people that they know. Honestly, it's probably as viable of a job seeking strategy to just try to find new people and like make new friends and try to get jobs through that networking layer. But it's not easy. Where do I put Freud and his ideas in my list of people influencing my understanding of psychology? Like directly influencing me? Probably not at all. In terms of like psychology as a field as it exists now, like probably wouldn't exist. Or, probably someone else would have taken his place if he didn't exist. But like You get what I mean? He single-handedly pioneered the field of psychotherapy. So, but like his actual ideas, like not really at all. Like things like sex and aggression drive as the two main forces, things like the Oedipal complex, things like the id, ego, and superego. He pioneered all of these ideas, and they're all robustly debunked. He had some really cool ideas that have stuck around. So things like the fact that the unconscious is something that likely exists and influences our conscious mind. That was a Freud idea. I think other people took that idea and expanded upon it and made the idea more practical and usable and interesting. But that was his idea. Is it possible for one without bipolar to experience a manic episode? Unless it was like, if it's not a part of like a psychotic episode, if it's not a part of, so some people with borderline personality disorder can experience what we call florid states. So it's kind of a period of mania. If it's not attributable to bipolar, it's attributable to some other type of disorder. If it's not attributable to one of those other disorders, it's bipolar. This shirt is not for me. I like this shirt, man. This is a nice shirt. What do you mean? All right, hang on. We have to take a poll in the chat. Number 1, if this shirt is for me. Number 2, if this shirt is not for me. I need to get the fashion advice off of TikTok because we know that is where the most fashionable people on the planet reside. What is the most important part in processing trauma? Does it vary from person to person? So 3 main components that I would consider really important to processing trauma. Changing your perception of yourself away from being overly negative and towards being more feeling safe, feeling confident, not feeling unresponsibly guilty for things that weren't actually your fault. That's really important. Desensitizing your emotional distress response to things that trigger memories of the trauma. That's really, really important. And stopping unproductive behaviors that you started because of the trauma. So, for example, avoiding people because you experienced traumatic bullying. Now you can't make friends or relationships. So stopping unproductive behaviors and being willing to put yourself out there again. Those are, I think, 3 really important parts to treating trauma. What would I say are the undetected ADHD effects in adults? Whoa, where do you want me to begin? There's a lot. So, Jesus. Other comorbid mental health conditions that they aren't sure why they keep cropping up. So constant anxiety, constant depression, and they're like, why does this keep happening? Well, it's because you haven't treated the ADHD. Difficulties in work performance, difficulties going to sleep, difficulties staying asleep, difficulties maintaining relationships, emotional dysregulation, alcohol use disorder, substance use disorder, reckless driving, reckless spending, impulsive spending. Like these are all things that come from untreated and undiagnosed adult ADHD, and they're all very common. All right, everyone's saying the shirt looks good, so whoever said my shirt didn't look good, you lose. Majority rules. What current belief in psychology do I believe will be looked back on as wrong? Oh, let's see. Do I have a spicy opinion about the field of psychology? That's what you're asking me. Because if it's a current belief, it means it's held by the majority. So do I have a spicy psychology take something that'll be looked back on as being wrong? It depends on the audience. Okay. Wait, it has to be a majority view though, right? A majority view. I would actually say that the majority of people who know about EMDR believe that bilateral stimulation is a legitimate treatment arm of the therapy. This is going to take some explaining, so bear with me, but it's pretty interesting. So EMDR is a form of therapy designed to help people who have trauma and traumatic stress. One part of EMDR is what the creator of EMDR called why is my text so small? Bilateral stimulation. So the way that they started doing this is, for example, they would sit in front of the person and they would move their fingers across, and the person would follow it with their eyes side to side. And the idea was you activate one side of the brain as it looks this way, one side of the brain as it looks this way, and you bilaterally stimulate the brain. And you engage this bilateral stimulation while the person thinks through a traumatic event. And this bilateral stimulation helps the brain to speed up like the way that it processes the memory and like bounces the memory all around the brain, so it heals the traumatic memory faster. And their evidence was, when we do this, when we get people to do the eye movements while thinking about the traumatic memory, they improve. Whereas if we just get them to sit there and close their eyes and think about it, like, they don't improve as much. So therefore, bilateral stimulation works. And EMDR textbooks to this day, 30 years after the creation of EMDR textbooks to this day are still saying that bilateral stimulation is an important part of the therapy. And even in the scripts that they teach therapists, they'll be like, okay, now you tell your client, now we're going to apply the bilateral stimulation, like you're applying a therapeutic technique. Bilateral stimulation does not appear to be actually a thing. Like, you might be activating parts of the brain, but that is not speeding up the therapeutic process. What does work? The eye movements do help compared to just sitting there and closing your eyes. The eye movements help. There's reasons they work, though, and it's not because it's bilaterally stimulating the brain. And the reason they work is, number one, grounding. So when the person's scanning the room back and forth, they're noticing that they're in the present moment, and it's helping their brain to learn that the trauma is in the past and it's behind them, and it keeps them in the present moment. And that's really, really good. Number two, memory access. For some people, like when they're thinking about memories and they're trying to recall memories, their eyes will move around naturally, and it helps with memory access. This one's a bit not super evidence-based. This is more of a hypothesis, and we haven't tested this one first, but I think this is true. Number three. Is there a number three? We got the grounding. Number three would be the present moment access, actually. Grounding and present moment are a little bit different. Grounding is like a calming skill. Number four would be the working memory component. So when you're thinking about the traumatic memory, you don't want it to like overwhelm your consciousness and like flood everything. So by doing like the eye movements, it's keeping a part of your brain busy. It's filling up a part of your working memory so that it can help you to remain in the present moment and not get flooded while you reprocess the memory. So the eye movements help, but they don't help because it's bilaterally stimulating. They help for these other factors. And the evidence for this, for what I'm saying, people have taken EMDR therapy and they've taken clients with PTSD and they go, what if we do EMDR and we take away this one thing and we do everything else? And then we put it back in, we take away this one other component, because EMDR has like multiple components, right? So like, what if we take away one component at a time to see which components actually matter? The bilateral stimulation doesn't matter. Doing these other things matters. Grounding, putting people in the present moment, taxing their working memory, these matter. So it's not because it's bilaterally stimulating, it's because it's having these other effects. The majority of people who are trained in EMDR believe it is effective, at least in part, because it is bilaterally stimulating. It is not. The evidence, it does not pan that out. And I think 30 years from now, that information will be better disseminated, more mainstream. At the moment, I think it's less than the majority of people believe in that. So that would be my take that I think we're going to look back on and realize, people are going to realize that we're wrong. I believe that's why walking therapy can be effective. Yeah, interestingly, the story of how EMDR started was that the founder of EMDR had like stress, and they were going for a walk in the park, and their eyes were like moving around, and they realized like, oh wow, these eye movements help. But maybe it's because they were walking, or maybe it's because they were doing both, and it was taxing their working memory while they thought about the stressful event, and this helped their brain to reprocess it. Not because it was bilaterally stimulating. I think they had an event that happened, they took the wrong conclusion out of it. The technique works. This is the important part. And yes, you can join the voice chat. The techniques of EMDR work, and they work well. The explanation that the EMDR Institute gives as to why they work, bilateral stimulation, simulating REM sleep, are not true. The evidence doesn't pan out. The evidence doesn't support that. but the techniques work. So, and that's the most important part, right? That is the most important part. It's more important that the technique's wrong and the explanation is... it's more important that the techniques work and the explanation is wrong than the explanation is right and the techniques don't work. And because we can always correct the explanation later on as long as people are getting better. Placebos work also. Placebos do work. And we always want to make sure that when we're creating therapies, we compare their effectiveness against placebos. Because if it's not outperforming a placebo, like, what are we doing? Clearly it doesn't work. It's just a placebo going to work. Can you do EMDR on yourself? You can do EMDR on yourself, but the research that has been done on self-applied EMDR tends to show that it doesn't work. It doesn't produce beneficial effects for the majority of people. For some people, they will try to self-administer EMDR and their symptoms actually get worse because they kind of flood themselves with the memory or whatever. They do it in a too uncontrolled way. Or they stop prematurely, so they reach the apex of distress, and then instead of pushing on and reaching resolution, they stop, right? Whatever the reasons are, people self-administering it will essentially get worse. Or for some people, they do it and it just doesn't work because they don't have the therapist telling them like when to stop, what to focus on, and guiding them through that. And I think that's an important part of it. And I imagine for some people, EMDR therapy for themselves will work. But on the whole, when you look at the generalization of like a group of people self-administering it, it seems like overall it's not an indicated thing. You shouldn't tell people to do it. How much do I think Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles feeds into mental health? What? Oh, oh, TMT. Okay. I thought you said TMNT. Terror management theory. So terror management theory is a really old theory that essentially people do what they do out of like a fear of death. It's one of those things that gets to the land of like borderline unfalsifiable, because you could say things like, for example, why do you have anxiety? Because you fear death. How do you know that? Well, take social anxiety. If you don't socialize with people, right, then you'll be like all by yourself. And if you're all by yourself, and we evolved like in the jungle with like lots of trees and stuff, and then a lion is gonna like come and eat you because you're all by yourself, right? So you're anxious because you fear death. It's unfalsifiable. You can always say that, well, everything traces back to a fear of death. On some degree, I kind of buy this. On some degree, I kind of don't. I don't think that it's the best framework for helping people, though. Because if a person goes, hey, I've got a speech coming up and I'm really afraid of giving this speech in front of a group of people, and you go, well, the reason you're afraid is because you're afraid of dying. Let's talk about that death anxiety of yours, bucko. I don't think that's going to be the most effective way of helping this person. So, well, terror management theory might really be the cause of everything. I don't think about it very often, and I don't think it's like very clinically applicable in a lot of cases. It's a fear of negative evaluation, not people. It's a fear of, where do you think that negative evaluation comes from? The fucking walls? You think the light bulbs are negatively evaluating you? What are you talking about? Hello in the voice chat. How you doing?
Hello. I'm doing good. How about you?
Doing well. Hold on. Give me one moment. Let me turn you up. You're rather quiet.
All right.
All right. That should be a little bit better. If people in the stream, if you can't hear them, let me know. All right. Do you have a question for me?
Yes. Regarding ADHD.
Okay.
Because I've seen like you've some posts on there as well on your account.
Yeah.
I've just stumbled across your life. I've not known you before.
Cool.
So yeah, basically, I never went to a psychologist, but I have met a psychiatrist once, and he suspected that I have ADHD, maybe combined with some depression as well. But he was very unprofessional, let me put it that way. And I never continued with the meetings, and I'm kind of like a little bit scared to like go into any sort of therapy. But on the other hand, I see on the internet like people saying that when they were actually diagnosed with ADHD and they took medication, that kind of their lives changed. But I am a little bit scared about taking medications, so I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, super normal. Most people do not want to like start popping psychoactive medications for like what's going on, especially if their life is like semi-functional. They're like, hey, this is kind of working for me. Like, what if things go wrong? That's very normal, very, very normal. I can't speak to individual cases. All I can speak to is like on average what tends to happen. On average, when people take ADHD medications, they live for longer. The reason for that is that they accidentally unalive themselves less often. So normally a lot of people with ADHD, they will drive too fast or they'll zone out while they're driving. This leads to motor vehicle accidents. So they live longer because they don't have accidental meetings with the Grim Reaper as often. It also results in like lower amounts of alcohol consumptions from impulsivity, lower amounts of substance use from impulsivity, better like financial situations, which leads to better health outcomes because of less impulsive spending, right? So people tend to live longer on these medications. They tend to be more productive. They tend to accelerate their careers more, which has beneficial outcomes like financially, and then that trickles down to like health. So generally, on the average, ADHD medications for adults tend to produce a whole host of like pretty positive effects. There are side effects. A lot of them have to do with, internal feelings of like losing your appetite, rapid weight loss. For some people, after the medications wear off, they kind of feel like really, really tired or zombified a little bit. So you have to kind of trade off the pros and the cons. One thing that's pretty clear as well, though, from my reading of ADHD medications is that most of the ones they will start you on as like a trial run are in and out of your system really quickly. Like, for example, Ritalin. Methylphenidate is in and out of your system normally within about 6 hours. That includes the benefits of it, but it also includes the side effects. So if you take it and the side effects suck, you just stop and they're gone. You wake up the next day, there's no more side effects. Yeah.
So no long-lasting effects, even if you take it for a longer period of time, or?
Yeah, and that's both a good and a bad, right? So no negative side effects from long-term use, but no positive side effects from long-term use. Yeah. So it's like one of those medications where like if you want the long-term effects, you're kind of on it long-term. There is a little bit of like you do get some positive effects long-term from it, but that comes from the fact that when you're on it long-term, you give yourself a really good amount of time to learn really good habits and behaviors that maybe you wouldn't have had the focus or capacity to learn and practice without the medication. And then when you stop the medication, you still have these really good habits. So that can stick around. Yeah. What are my thoughts on Wi-Fi routers and radio frequencies causing mental illness? Absolutely true. There's actually a 5G tower down my road. I saw Bill Gates himself plugging it in. It's a crazy world out there, man. Is there a biological test to test out ADHD reliably for an individual? No. So there are tests where if you take like 100 people and you put them into like, scanners, and that like 50 of them have, actually bigger scale. If you take like 500 people, right? And that 250 of them have ADHD and 250 of them don't, and you put them into like this brain scanning device, and then you look at like the results of the people who have ADHD, they will have like there will be like an average result from the machine that goes like, on average, people with ADHD have like these results, and then people with no ADHD have like these results, right? On average. But it's not specific enough for individuals. So you'll get plenty of individuals who have ADHD but have this result. You'll have plenty of individuals without ADHD who have this result. And so it's just not specific enough on the individual level. So brain scans and stuff can work on the group level, but not enough to be diagnostically helpful because it's not specific enough for individuals.
Funny enough, this kind of ties into my experience with this psychiatrist.
I'm curious. Yeah, Are you okay with sharing that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, I had one meeting with that psychiatrist, one session, and we went basically just over how my functionality in life is, my past, and so on. And he gave me pretty quickly like some, I don't know how you call them. Basically, he gave me like kind of like appointments or something for like other doctors and stuff that like are his like colleagues or whatever. And he told me basically that I have to like do these kinds of brain scans and everything, and they were rather expensive.
Mm.
And he told me to basically come back to him when I have all the data. And without this data, he can't diagnose me. That's what he told me.
Yeah.
He gave me the second appointment for like 2 months in advance. I did not have it was not in the financial situation to get all these checks done and everything. I still showed up to the second appointment, and basically he did not even expect me to come because I didn't even send any data. Literally got some other patient for the same appointment time as I had. So somebody else walked in even though I was there.
Right. Okay.
And in the end, he told me there is no reason for us to even talk or have any type of therapy session or anything productive. He just charged me that hour as well and gave me the same things again to go and make checkups. And
Yeah.
And I never went to seek for any help or anything in that sense.
Yeah, press F to pay respects. That is a tragedy. That's an unfortunate waste of time and money right there. Look, the big thing is a lot of medical clinicians, we want clear-cut answers, right? We want a tool where you like do it and then it just shows a green button or a red button. It's like you have it or you're not. People want really clear answers. The unfortunate reality is there's no test at the moment that's just like bing, bing, bing with like high enough accuracy to actually be useful. But people really desperately want there to be one. So they will put people through tests that do cost many, many hundreds, thousands of dollars that only have like, you know, a 70 or 80% true positive rate. And like that's better than 50-50, but it's not good enough to be like diagnostically valid on an individual level because that's too big of an error rate. Yeah,
that was just a little bit rough for me because I am like not as functional as I'd want to be. So also my financial situation wasn't as great. And then he gives me like 2 or 3 random checks that I should do. And when you sum up all of them, like, you know, it comes to like 2,000 or 3,000 euro. That was just like absolutely not possible. It kind of felt for me that he just tried to like, you know, I guess him helping out his colleagues with another patient or something, you know, that's what it kind of felt like to me. So.
I honestly don't think it was that, because most of the psychiatrists and people in this field, they're all making bajillions of dollars anyway. They don't need to circle jerk each other off with referrals. But I think for what a lot of it is that there's a lot of clinicians who are uncomfortable relying on themselves and their own clinical interpretation. Like they don't trust themselves to be really good evaluators from an interview and making observations. So they want some kind of third party evidence that can justify like the things that they're saying. And so it comes from more of a place of like insecurity about their own ability to diagnostically interview and evaluate people.
Okay, I see.
And also it kind of takes the responsibility off of them in a way as well, right? Because if these tests come back and then they go, well, look, the test says this and it's not me, you know, don't blame me, the test says this, right? So
yeah. I mean, to top it off, there is like one extra little thing that was just that made the situation even funnier, because when I got home, I even got like a day later and automatically sent a letter to my address that charged me for not showing up.
Oh, Jesus.
So, so he like already expected me to not show up, gave an appointment to another patient for the same time, and told me that I have to pay for the hour that, you know, we are not even gonna talk because I didn't do any checks.
Yeah, that's pretty fucked.
After that bad situation, I don't know. That was like 2 years ago. Since then, I haven't even looked to like go to any sorts of therapy or anything, because it just demotivated me completely. Because even going there like was like a little bit tough for me, like to convince myself, you know.
Yeah. No, that's super understandable. That's a pretty fucked experience. I will say, like, yeah, probably you want to, like, if you can save the money for it to get in to see a different psychiatrist, one who like specializes in ADHD. It's like on average, the benefits that you can get from probably treating ADHD are really big. So it's probably worth it.
Yeah, because I don't know, like I don't really see a big sense in like to a psychologist because like I feel like all past trauma I have kind of like solved with myself. Let me say it like that. Like I don't have like any huge issues about that. It's more just like I'm not functional and I want to change that, and I think medication could help, but I'm a little bit scared to take that step. So
yeah, for sure. I don't think I'm not in the camp of like everyone needs to see a psychologist or a therapist. Like I think people are fine, you know, like a decent amount of people are just fine. And if you like feel like you've actually brought those things to a positive resolution, then that's pretty cool. Yeah, I'd say
no, it's all about sorting functionality and being like a normal, stable, productive person. You know.
Yeah, for sure. All right, well, thank you for sharing that. It was interesting.
Yeah, why not? I mean, thank you for the input, and you took a little bit of fear away from the medication, because you know, like, when I say it to friends, and it's like, oh, like it's all big pharma, and all of this is only to make you addicted. And
it's George Soros is coming in, handing you the pills directly. He's yeah.
That's why I saw the opportunity, and I was like, hey, I'm gonna ask somebody who actually knows this stuff, you know?
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that. Like, that's one of the reasons why I started making videos and like doing these live streams, is just to answer questions that I feel like people need clearer answers to. And also because I have a high degree of confidence in the things that I speak on, and there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I feel like, yeah, that needs to get corrected at some point.
Fair. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I appreciate it. You too. What would a psychologist do to treat CPTSD? Okay, so for people who don't know, CPTSD stands for complex PTSD. For people who don't know what PTSD is, it stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. So basically, people go through a traumatic event, something that gives them a psychological trauma, psychological injury, and then after that, post that, they develop significant amount of symptoms of stress that are disordering their life. Complex PTSD, in the ICD-10, which is a diagnostic manual, basically is like when people go through big series of multiple traumas that they can't escape from. In popular lingo, people use CPTSD to mean a lot of different things. Mostly what people are talking about, though, is developmental trauma. So, you know, living with parents who didn't love you, who neglected you, or like, you know, consistent childhood, like trauma after trauma after trauma. That's what most people are talking about when they're talking about CPTSD. Generally speaking, the treatment for CPTSD is multifaceted. So one of them is like looking into the past. So you would look at what happened in the past that kind of made you who you are. Are there unhelpful lessons that you've learned? Are there traumatic memories that are still distressing when you think about them? Can we work through those? Can we reprocess them? Can we desensitize the past and stop it from bleeding into your present day? Then we would look at the present. What are you doing at the moment that is like quite unhelpful and hurting your life? Can we stop that? What are the triggers that happen in the present day? What are moments in times where you regularly struggle? Let's sort out those things with cognitive behavioral therapy. Then let's look into the future. What are situations that you anticipate getting yourself into where you're likely to act in a way that is unproductive to the goals you have in life? And let's do some skill building so that you can handle the situation better. Let's do some role playing. Let's do some preparation. So generally with CPTSD, we're looking at past, present, and future, and we're trying to address each of them. I'm 40, struggling to keep any job no matter how simple because I have no memory retention. Oh god, dude, this is a question for like a neuropsychologist. you probably want to go to see a neuropsych, or go to probably just go straight to a neuropsych. They'll do like a memory evaluation with you. They'll probably do something like the WMS, the Wechsler Memory Scale. They might do some other types of memory testing as well. This is a neuropsych question, not for me, unfortunately. It's outside of my area of specialization.
Am I able to ask a question?
Yeah, shoot. Go ahead.
So my partner last year went for an ADHD diagnosis,
Mm.
and
Yep.
with the psychiatrist here in Melbourne, did it over chat, and then even though they had a lot of ADHD symptoms, the psychiatrist had written them off and just saying you have CPTSD, and because the trauma had started from an early age, like developmental like area, like around 3 and 4, that it presents itself as ADHD, but it's not ADHD, it's a learning disability. So I was just wondering if you can explain, how does that work? How does someone, I guess, get a learning disability from trauma?
So when he's saying learning disability, do you mean like this is like a specific learning disorder in like reading and writing or something like that? Or
Yes, so he mentioned that because my partner just takes a bit longer to kind of just get the concept of things when it comes to like social cues, which can also look like ADHD/autism, but obviously I know there's like a certain amount in order to meet the criteria because it is a spectrum, but they said it was a specific learning disability. They just said developmental learning disability, and that a psychologist can clarify it. But for me, I'm genuinely curious about how does it actually occur.
so I'm doing a bit of Googling here because developmental learning disability is not a diagnosable condition, which is why I haven't really come across it before. It's a term in the research, but like diagnostically and clinically, we don't use this term. So it's really interesting that the psychiatrists use this term. When we're thinking about specific learning disorders, typically what we're talking about are things like, dyslexia, dyscalculia, things like difficulties with like reading, writing, comprehension, things like that, mathematics, right? When we're talking about specific learning disorders in terms of, or like difficulties with learning when it comes to the socialization realm of things, this isn't like a specific learning disorder realm. We don't consider it like a specific learning disorder. I've worked, quite a lot with children and teenagers in like the education space as well. Typically what we would say is if it's falling into the extreme end, it might be something like social pragmatic disorder. It used to be called social pragmatic communication disorder, where people like really struggle socially to like learn these things and apply these skills. That's like a branch of something that's related to autism. But yes, developmental learning disability is not like a diagnostic term. So interesting that he would say that. Some symptoms of trauma can look like ADHD because trauma can create delays in like brain neural development, especially in early kids, and it can also create symptoms that look like ADHD, like difficulties focusing, difficulties concentrating, difficulties staying on one task. Like all of these things can be a trauma response, so it can be a little bit difficult to differentiate. The primary difference between these things is like the way that you would treat ADHD is like medication first, psychotherapy second. Trauma would be psychotherapy first, medication second. But yeah, that opinion that your psychiatrist gave to your partner is not one that I've ever seen a psychiatrist give to anyone else before. So unfortunately, I don't really know how to handle that because I've never encountered that before.
Yeah, it was really interesting because I I had a late diagnosis for ADHD myself, and I was like, I have never heard of something like this, and my lived experience was quite similar to theirs. Obviously, you know, it can't be perfectly applicable because we are two different people, but they just presented with so many symptoms, and then he said that specific term in the psychiatrist report, and I was like, what is this? And then I looked it up, and I came across the same thing where it's like, it's just research papers, and it's quite vague. So I was like, I don't even know how to go about this, like supporting them, because it's like,
I would say, yeah. You can always get second opinions on things, guys. Like, just like people would get second opinions about like medical things or second quotes about like mechanical things with their car, you can get second opinions with mental health related things as well. Obviously, cost is the primary barrier to that because these things are really expensive. But like, if you feel like your personal experience really isn't matching up to what's happening or the advice that you're getting, it can be worth getting a second or third opinion. If all of those opinions are lining up, then that's probably definitely like a you issue. Very, very likely. There's obviously fringe cases where that's not the case, but yeah, sometimes getting like second opinions on things can be good.
awesome. Thank you so much for your opinion. I appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for the question.
Bye.
Your brother, bipolar, entered psychosis, won't get on meds, delusions of grandeur and demons. How can you help? This is the really, really tricky thing. As a family member, a lot of this ends up being outside of your control until it's borderline really dangerous, because you kind of need to get him into an intensive care facility. So things like, I don't know what they call it in other states and countries. Here we call it the acute care team, the ACT team. Every hospital has an acute care team, and generally, like, you call them up and they will come to the person, they'll do an evaluation, and if need be, they will like admit the person to hospital and like make sure that they're not hurting themselves. So generally you have to get like the acute care team or whatever the equivalent is involved. But generally they won't get involved unless it's really severe. It's really rough. It's really rough. You can try getting connected with some like emergency services and ask them for advice and see like if they know any services in your area, because obviously like not only does it differ state to state, country to country, but even within states things are different. Do you think ADHD and autism should work a normal job? I think it depends on the individual. Some people with ADHD and autism can work all kinds of jobs. People need to just find what individually works for them. Everyone's needs in terms of sensory needs, communication needs, they're all very, very varied. So it's very individual. But you know, you can look at just about any job in the world and you'll find some autistic person or some ADHD person who has the capacity to work it. Do I recommend studying psychology? I think it's a fun degree. I like it. What's my thoughts on BPD with psychotic features? It exists. So, how would you treat exhaustion syndrome? Why does it make you feel like a 90-year-old? Step one is, whenever people ask these things, if you haven't gotten a sleep study already, get a sleep study. Sleep study, sleep study, sleep study. The amount of people who I've had come to me with like issues of fatigue and I get them to get a sleep study, they have sleep apnea, they get it treated, they're better. It's a high enough, it's not like 100% of people, obviously. It's actually like probably not even over 50%, but it's a high enough percentage where like the amount of effort it takes to do it and the treatment that you get from it and how effective it is when it does work, it's so high, like get a sleep study. You had people come by today. It felt like a big nothing sandwich. He wouldn't stick around. Yeah, this is the unfortunate reality. Like when people are like going through essentially psychotic episodes, unless they're like super dangerous, like you just can't do anything. Obviously, like do what you can to try to keep them safe, remove all the knives and whatever, remove the rope, remove the stools, remove the keys to the vehicle and monitor them. And then if the condition degrades significantly, then call the people again and then they'll come out and actually do something. It's like one of those really weird waiting games where you're just waiting for it to get bad enough that you can actually get emergency services to step in and help. You want to be a child psychologist. Do you need a doctorate? Depends on the country you're in. So here in Australia, no. In America, I think a lot of places you need to get a doctorate and PhD or whatever. Here in Australia, if you want to be a child psychologist, you just need to get either your general registration, which generally takes about 6 years, or you can get a specific ed and dev psychology master's program. That again takes 6 years. Either or. You don't have to get the ed and dev course to be a child psychologist, but your learning from university will be more specialized. But that doesn't really matter very much, because the majority of learning you do to get good at your job at being a psychologist doesn't come from university. It comes from the self-study that you do afterwards. How many hours a day and a week are you willing to pour into continued education and learning? That's going to matter a lot more than the time you spend in university. University is the foundation that you need. It teaches you how to get really good at understanding which research is good, what research is bad. It sets up your mindset. It gives you a baseline level of knowledge that you're going to need. But then from there, you're going to be a psychologist for decades afterwards. So the knowledge that you gain afterwards is obviously going to stack up a lot more. Sociology as a science field seems fine. People just need to not take it every single research article super seriously. Obviously, we know there's a reproduction difficulty with a lot of studies. So until you see experiments reproduced, take them with heaping piles of salt. Why do I think people with BPD get special treatments, but NPDs and ASPDs don't? Generally speaking, because people with BPD tend to do a lot more damage to themselves, whereas people with NPD and ASPD tend to do a lot more damage to other people, and we tend to be more forgiving of people who damage themselves rather than damage others. Do people with NPD and ASPD hurt themselves? Absolutely. Do people with BPD hurt other people? Absolutely. But generally speaking, the damage with BPD tends to be more internal and self-inflicted compared to NPD and ASPD. What tests are needed for an ADHD diagnosis? How do you differentially diagnose from BPD? So generally with ADHD, you're primarily testing through structured clinical interviews and collateral interviews / information. So things like old historic report cards, interviews with the person's partner, interviews with the person's parents, right? And the way that you differentiate this from, wait, did you say differentiate from bipolar disorder? BPD. Do you mean bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder? I'll answer both. So with borderline, you won't see restricted, repetitive behavior and sensory sensitivity as a diagnostic feature of borderline. Can people with borderline personality disorder have sensory sensitivity? Sure. But on the whole, it's not a diagnostic thing. A lot of people... what am I doing? Hang on. Sorry, my brain's in the gutter. It's literally time for me to go to sleep. My brain's in the gutter. I thought we were talking about autism again for a minute. Okay. How do you differentiate ADHD from borderline personality disorder? ADHD, not autism. So with ADHD, you still, structured clinical interview, collateral information, blah, blah, blah. With borderline personality disorder, you see self-harm as a diagnostic feature. That's not a diagnostic feature of ADHD. You see things like potential florid states or what we call manic states of borderline. That's pretty rare, but you definitely don't see that in ADHD. You tend to see severe unstable pattern of relationships that break down due to fear of rejection / abandonment. You don't see that in ADHD. ADHD can have difficulties difficulties maintaining relationships, but that's because people with ADHD struggle with maintenance of relationships. They will forget to text people back. They will forget to go to outings. They will annoy people by talking too much in a conversation. Borderline breaks down relationships because of fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, or splitting behaviors. So it's through these things that you can very, very easily differentiate the two, because almost always you'll have not this one. This is pretty rare. Florid states are rare. But this one, diagnostic feature of borderline, you don't see them in ADHD. people with ADHD do have what we're calling rejection sensitivity dysphoria, but they won't prematurely cut people off with like the way that borderline does it. It's pretty different. People with ADHD are like more sensitive to criticism, generally speaking, because they've been criticized a lot throughout their life, whereas people with borderline personality disorder are essentially paranoid that people are going to like abandon them and leave them. You just don't see that in ADHD. Not enough for it to be like common. Advice for convincing aggressive cannabis-induced psychotic to go to the hospital. Nope. If you know the answer, tell me, because nobody knows the answer to this one. You have to dangle something they really want. That's pretty much it. Otherwise, you call the ambulance and you say, hey, welfare check, this person really needs to be in a hospital, like immediately. They're a danger to themselves and others. Can you have both? Yep, you can have ADHD and borderline personality disorder simultaneously. And in those cases, you will see ADHD with all of the difficulties with concentration and attention maintenance, hyperactivity, and you'll see it with significant fears of rejection and self-harming behaviors and severely unstable relationship patterns. You can definitely have ADHD with borderline. In fact, a massive amount of people with borderline personality disorder have ADHD. Not many people with ADHD have borderline personality disorder. It doesn't go the other way, but a massive amount of people with borderline have ADHD. Why are psychiatrists hesitant to diagnose borderline? Mostly because of the stigma attached to it, and it was also like kind of like thrown around a bit flippantly as a diagnosis. So these days people are trying to be a bit more careful with it. How can I get rid of OCD? Exposure and response prevention therapy can be administered by a clinician who has training in ERP, exposure response prevention. Go find one, hop on Google, search ERP therapist near me. Does CPTSD come with explosive anger? Could this be another disorder on top? Could be either or. Some people, as a trauma response, maybe it's what they witnessed was a large amount of aggression, or maybe what they learned to survive was exhibiting large amounts of aggression. And so, you know, the explosive anger could be a symptom of their trauma, or it could be something else. I have high-functioning autism, but I've been around them. I don't fit in at all. Misdiagnosed? Question mark. Generally speaking, if you're going to get diagnosed with autism, the person diagnosing you would tell you why and explain like why they think you're autistic. Have a read of the report, see what they say, see if that checks out. All right, I'm probably going to answer questions for like another 2 or 3 minutes, then I'm hopping off. So let's make these some good questions to wrap up with. Also, if anyone has any questions they want to get answered now or later, my Discord is in the link tree in my bio. There's a Q&A segment there. You can drop questions there. I'll either answer them in a live stream or in a future Q&A video. Also, if you want priority on getting your questions answered, drop them in the Discord, because I can read the Discord chat a lot easier than the TikTok chat, because the TikTok chat moves too fast. Recognizing you're falling back into depression, but not keen to go back on meds. What should I do? A good place to start is the times that you've pulled yourself out of depressive cycles. What worked for you then? And can you do that again? Or can you do even just a part of that again? Maybe there's just like one part of what you did before, then you can try and do that again. Otherwise, like the general things for maintenance work really well for most people. So try to make sure you're sleeping and waking at the same time. Get morning sunlight exposure, get nighttime darkness exposure. Engage in daily exercise and at least 2 to 3 times a week of intensive exercise. Make sure that your diet is fine. So spread out your meals, 2 to 3 to 4 meals a day. Don't eat too much in one sitting. Don't eat too much shit. Don't eat too little, because otherwise if you have no energy, you're more likely to get depressed as well. All of these things, right? They're chalk and cheese. They're the standard first line things to recommend, but it's because they work. What's the difference between me and a therapist? So I am a psychologist who also works as a therapist. Not all therapists are psychologists, though. A lot of people who call themselves therapists don't necessarily really have any formal training, degrees, or even if they do, they don't have any formal regulation and oversight. Depends on the country. Some countries, they do have that. In Australia, people can call themselves a therapist without any training or oversight or regulation, whereas to be a psychologist, you have to have a minimum of 6 years of training, and you have to be regulated with AHPRA, our health regulation board, that's connected to the government, and there's a lot of regulation and oversight. Do you have to be talkative to have ADHD? What about people that to behave by, like, yeah, you don't have to be super talkative to have ADHD. It is like a characteristic of ADHD that people will like talk too much, but like it's not always the case. If someone has antisocial personality disorder, OCD, ADHD, and CPTSD, can you unpack how this would look in an individual? Very messy. Generally speaking, what we'd probably be seeing is like a ton of like really impulsive behaviors that hurt them, that hurt other people. Probably a lot of aggression if I'm looking at ADHD, ASPD, and CPTSD combined. This person's probably had significant contacts with the law. Their life is probably very, very unfunctional with that combination of ADHD and OCD. This person needs a lot of help. How do I stop people pleasing? So it's a bit individualized. You need to figure out why you personally are people pleasing. Some people please out of fear of like what would happen if they don't, like what that would mean about them. Would they not be a good daughter? Would they not be a good person? Would they be a bad member of society? Or would their life fall apart? Or are they going to get aggressed upon? Are people going to hurt them? Right? It's really individualized. Figure out why you're people pleasing. You figure that out by asking yourself like, what would happen if I stopped? If I didn't people please, what would go wrong? What would be bad about that? From there, you get your answers on how to stop people pleasing. Why do anger issues from childhood get worse with age? They don't necessarily. For some people, they will. For some people, they'll resolve. For some people, they stay the same. It's not, I don't think it's true to say for most people that they get worse with age. I think actually probably they get better with age. People tend to mature. They get around more situations. They learn to practice self-control. They get better at it as their brain essentially develops as they get older. For some people, though, that's not going to be the case. All right, final question. I'm going to answer one more question and I'm going to hop off. Again, my Discord is in my link tree. You can go there. There's a Q&A channel. There's a general chat if you guys want to talk about anything. You'll also be able to figure out when I'm live because I'll be jumping into the voice chat on my Discord every time I'm live. So you can always hop in and ask questions there. Do I believe in Jesus Christ, the Lord and Savior? Who knows? One day I'll wrap my head around whether or not to answer these types of questions on stream. Why is not dissociating us physically tiring? For some people it is physically tiring, but for most people it's like you're essentially clonking out of existence, right? So it should be pretty chilling. It should be bing chilling because like you're clonking out of reality. So your body can just like take a rest. But for a lot of people it is tiring because they tend to dissociate in highly stressful situations, and so they've got like a big stress response, a big cortisol release, a big physiological activation, so they are normally tired afterwards. Not because they're dissociating, but because they were in a stressful situation in the first place. All right, question from the Discord chat. Is there any way to discreetly see a psychologist or psychiatrist as a 17-year-old in Australia? If you're in Australia, Headspace. Headspace is your go-to at that age, especially if you're going by yourself because it's government funded. Otherwise, you'd have to you have to pay your own. And as a 17-year-old, you're not going to have many hundreds of dollars lying around for therapy. So what you want to do as a 17-year-old, book in to see a GP. GPs are not obligated to tell your parents as long as you can understand what confidentiality is and how it applies to you. So as long as you can understand confidentiality and how that applies, then a GP should be obligated to keep confidential and not inform your parents. If you are self-disclosing, like the fact that you want to rope yourself, they might try to tell your parents or whatever, but that's up to you then if you want to self-disclose that. But yeah, go to your GP, get a referral to Headspace, talk to Headspace. They work with people under the age of 25, and it's bulk billed, so it's government funded. Do I like chicken? Chicken is awesome, dude. Who doesn't like chicken? Yes, Headspace gives 10 free sessions, yeah, per calendar year normally. Wait, is it 10 lifetime? I thought it was 10 per calendar year, but yeah, Headspace. Headspace is the go-to. All right, everybody, that's the stream. My Discord is in my link tree, which is in my bio. Click my picture, join the Discord. You'll be able to see whenever I'm live in the future. There's a Q&A channel there. If you want your questions answered with priority, you can dump them in the Q&A. If I don't answer them in the live stream, I might answer them in a future Q&A video. And I've got a Q&A video from some of my previous live streams that should be coming out probably sometime this week. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time. Later.